There is a piece of the armor of God that most teachers skip, not because it is obscure, not because it requires advanced theological training to understand, not because the Greek is ambiguous or the translation is disputed. They skip it because it does not sound like armor. It does not sound like something you wear into battle. It does not sound like a weapon or a shield or a piece of protective equipment. It sounds like something you do before the armor goes on, something preparatory, something subordinate to the real spiritual warfare happening in the rest of the passage. And because it sounds that way, most teachers treat it that way. They get to the end of the armor list, they mention it briefly, they frame it as a supplement to the armor, and they move on. But Paul does not treat it that way. Paul places it after the armor list, and then spends more words on it than he spends on any single piece of armor in the entire passage. More words than the belt of truth, more words than the breastplate of righteousness, more words than the shield of faith, or the helmet of salvation, or the sword of the Spirit. And he does not present it as an addition to the armor. He presents it as the thing that holds everything else together. The piece that most teachers forget is the piece Paul could not stop talking about, and its name is prayer. Before we go to the prayer passage, we need to understand something about the structure of Ephesians 6 that almost every reader misses. Most people read the armor of God passage as a list: belt, breastplate, boots, shield, helmet, sword, prayer, 7 items, parallel construction, each one a piece of equipment for the spiritual warrior. But that is not actually how Paul writes it. He writes the armor in 2 movements. The first movement is verses 13 through 17. 6 pieces of armor named in sequence. Put on the full armor of God: belt, breastplate, boots, shield, helmet, sword. And then verse 18 begins differently. And pray in the Spirit on all occasions with all kinds of prayers and requests. The Greek construction here is not another item in a list. It is a participial phrase that modifies everything that came before it. It is describing the manner and the atmosphere in which all the armor is worn. Paul is not saying, here is the 7th piece of armor, prayer. He is saying, all of this armor, everything I have just described, is worn in the context of this. Prayer is not the 7th piece of equipment. Prayer is the atmosphere in which the other 6 function. It is the air inside the armor. And without air, armor is just a very heavy, very uncomfortable cage. Let us read what Paul actually says about prayer. All of it. Because most teachers quote the first sentence and move on, and the power of this passage is in the full text. And pray in the Spirit on all occasions, with all kinds of prayers and requests. With this in mind, be alert, and always keep on praying for all the Lord's people. Pray also for me, that whenever I speak, words may be given me, so that I will fearlessly make known the mystery of the gospel, for which I am an ambassador in chains. Pray that I may declare it fearlessly, as I should. 4 verses on prayer alone. And look at what those verses contain. On all occasions, all kinds of prayers. Always keep on praying for all the Lord's people, for Paul specifically, for fearlessness in declaring the gospel, for the mystery of the gospel to be made known, declared fearlessly, as it should be. This is not a brief addendum. This is an extended, layered, carefully constructed description of what prayer actually is and what it actually does in the context of spiritual warfare. And it contains details that most readers walk past without stopping to examine. The first detail is the one that should stop everyone cold. Pray in the Spirit. Not pray with the Spirit. Not pray for the Spirit. Pray in the Spirit. In the same way that a fish is in water, not holding water, not swimming toward water, but existing inside the element that sustains it, Paul says the prayer he is describing happens inside the Spirit. Prayer that operates in the Spirit is prayer that has moved beyond the surface of human language and human agenda. It is prayer that has been taken up by something larger than the person praying. It is prayer where the Spirit of God, who knows the will of the Father perfectly, and who knows the needs of the believer completely, is doing something in and through the act of prayer that the believer themselves cannot fully understand or articulate. Paul says this explicitly in Romans 8. In the same way, the Spirit helps us in our weakness. We do not know what we ought to pray for, but the Spirit himself intercedes for us through wordless groans. And he who searches our hearts knows the mind of the Spirit, because the Spirit intercedes for God's people in accordance with the will of God. We do not know what we ought to pray for. This is one of the most honest admissions in the New Testament, and it is an admission that most Christians quietly share but rarely speak out loud. We do not always know what to ask for. We do not always know what the right outcome looks like. We do not always know which battle to prioritize, or which request to press, or which situation requires intercession and which requires surrender. We do not know, but the Spirit knows. And when prayer moves into the Spirit, it moves into the one who does know, who knows the will of the Father, who knows the needs of the moment, who can carry the weight of what we cannot name. This is the first hidden power of what Paul calls prayer in the Spirit. Not the eloquence of the words, not the length of the prayer, not the emotional intensity of the moment, the participation of the Spirit in the asking. On all occasions. This phrase is the one that exposes the gap between the prayer Paul describes and the prayer most believers actually practice. On all occasions. Not on the occasions when the crisis is severe enough to justify prayer. Not on the occasions when the Sunday service creates the right atmosphere. Not on the occasions when you have successfully cleared your mental schedule and found a quiet place and achieved the right level of focus. On all occasions. The Greek is en panti kairo, in every season, in every moment, in every circumstance. The armor of God is worn continuously, not just when you consciously put it on. And the prayer that holds the armor in place operates continuously, not just when you kneel and close your eyes. This is not a call to perpetual formal prayer. It is a description of a life lived in ongoing awareness of the presence of God, a life where the conversation between the believer and their Creator is not limited to designated prayer times, but runs beneath everything else, like a current beneath the surface of a river. Brother Lawrence, a 17th century monk who spent most of his time washing dishes in a monastery kitchen, described this as practicing the presence of God. The sustained, deliberate, unbroken awareness of God's presence in the middle of ordinary activity. The short, unpolished, honest exchanges with God that happen in the margins of the day as much as in its dedicated moments. This is what, on all occasions, looks like in practice. And it is this continuous quality of prayer that Paul connects directly to the armor of God. Because the armor is not just for the dramatic confrontations, it is for the ordinary day, the Tuesday afternoon, the commute, the meeting, the conversation with the difficult person, the moment of temptation that arrives without warning in the middle of a perfectly normal situation. On all occasions, the armor works on all occasions, and prayer sustains the armor on all occasions, with all kinds of prayers and requests. Most Christians have a narrow prayer vocabulary. They know how to ask God for things. They know how to thank Him for things. They may know how to confess to Him. They may have learned a formula or a structure that shapes their prayer times. But Paul describes a breadth of prayer that goes well beyond the standard categories. All kinds of prayers. The Greek word for prayers here is proseuchai. It is a broad term covering all forms of address to God, but Paul adds to it the word requests, diseis, which carries a more urgent, more specific, more desperate quality. It is the word for the prayer of someone who needs something they cannot provide for themselves. And then there is the intercession that Paul describes later in the passage when he asks the Ephesians to pray for him, not for his comfort, not for his release from prison, for fearlessness in declaring the gospel, for the mystery of the gospel to be made known. Intercession. the prayer that carries another person into the presence of God and holds them there. And underlying all of it is the kind of prayer Paul describes in Romans 8, the wordless groan, the prayer that has moved beyond language into something the Spirit carries directly to the Father. All kinds of prayers, which means the prayer that holds the armor together is not one thing. It is as varied as the occasions it covers, as personal as the person praying, as specific as the needs of the moment. It is the belt of truth buckled in the morning, and the wordless groan at 3 in the morning, and the specific intercession for a friend whose situation you cannot fix, and the desperate asking for something you need, and the quiet thanksgiving in the middle of a day that has not produced any obvious reason to be thankful. All of it, all kinds, on all occasions. Be alert. Paul inserts this instruction in the middle of the prayer passage, and most readers treat it as a parenthetical warning. Stay awake, pay attention, do not fall asleep during your prayer time. But the Greek word is agrupnite. It means to be sleepless, to remain in a state of watchful wakefulness, to resist the pull toward drowsiness and inattention. And in the context of spiritual warfare, this alertness is not primarily about staying awake during prayer. It is about remaining aware of the battle during the ordinary moments of life. Jesus used the same language in the Garden of Gethsemane. Watch and pray so that you will not fall into temptation. The spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak. The disciples fell asleep. 3 times Jesus came back to find them sleeping at the moment when watchfulness mattered most, at the moment when the betrayer was approaching and the soldiers were on their way, and the hour that Jesus had been preparing for throughout his entire ministry was arriving. They slept. And the warning embedded in that story is the same warning Paul is giving in Ephesians 6. The danger is not always announced. The arrows do not always come with a warning signal. The day of evil does not always send advance notice. The soldier who has taken off his armor because nothing seems to be happening right now is the soldier who cannot respond when the attack arrives without warning. Be alert. Keep the armor on. Keep the prayer running. Remain watchful, even in the seasons of peace, because the enemy of your soul does not observe a ceasefire. Always keep on praying for all the Lord's people. This is the instruction that most individual, privatized Western Christianity finds most difficult to fully inhabit. Not just pray, always keep on praying for all the Lord's people. The armor of God is communal armor. It is designed to be worn in formation, and the prayer that sustains it is communal prayer. Not just prayer for your own needs, your own battles, your own family, your own situation. Prayer for all the Lord's people, the believer in the prison cell you have never heard of, the pastor in the country you cannot locate on a map, the new convert who is holding on by a thread in a community that wants her to go back to what she was before, the elderly saint whose name you do not know, who has been praying faithfully for 60 years and whose prayer has been holding ground you are currently standing on. All the Lord's people. This is the dimension of prayer that transforms individual spiritual survival into something that participates in the mission of God across the entire earth. When you pray for all the Lord's people, you are not just supplementing your own armor. You are contributing to the armor of the whole body. You are adding your intercession to a global network of prayer that spans every language and every culture and every generation of the church. Paul understood this because Paul experienced it. He was in prison. He could not go anywhere. He could not preach. He could not plant churches. He could not travel the trade routes of the Mediterranean as he had done for decades. But he could pray, and he could ask others to pray. And the letter to the Ephesians, written in chains, asking people he could not visit to pray for people he could not reach, became one of the most powerful documents in the history of the church. The most effective minister in the early church did some of his most important work from a prison cell, because prayer is not limited by location. And then Paul does something that should stop every reader. He asks for prayer for himself, not prayer for his release, not prayer for his comfort, not prayer for the circumstances of his imprisonment to improve. Pray also for me, that whenever I speak, words may be given me, so that I will fearlessly make known the mystery of the gospel, for which I am an ambassador in chains. Pray that I may declare it fearlessly, as I should. Fearlessly. He says it twice. Paul, who had been beaten and stoned and shipwrecked and imprisoned, and left for dead and threatened with execution, asks for prayer for fearlessness, which means the most battle-tested apostle in the early church still felt afraid, which means the spiritual armor that Paul had been wearing for decades, the belt and the breastplate and the boots and the shield and the helmet and the sword, did not automatically eliminate fear. It gave him the capacity to act despite fear, and the thing that sustained that capacity was prayer, his own, and the prayer of others on his behalf. He is an ambassador in chains. An ambassador represents a king. An ambassador speaks on behalf of a sovereign. An ambassador carries the authority of the throne they represent, regardless of the circumstances they find themselves in. Paul is in chains. The chains are real. The prison is real. The danger is real. But he is still an ambassador. The chains have not changed the throne he represents, or the authority that throne carries. The prison has not altered the identity of the king who sent him. And what he needs, more than release, is the courage to keep being what he is, in the middle of what is happening. He needs to be fearless, and he asks his readers to pray for that. Now we come to the question that this forgotten piece of the armor of God puts to every reader. If prayer is the atmosphere in which all the armor functions, if prayer is the thing that holds the belt and the breastplate and the shield and the helmet and the sword in place, if prayer is what enables the ambassador in chains to remain fearless and the soldier under attack to remain standing, then what happens to the armor when prayer is absent? The answer is not that the armor immediately falls off. You do not lose your salvation because you missed your prayer time this morning, but something changes. The armor becomes heavier. The belt becomes harder to hold. The shield arm grows tired. The sword arm weakens. The helmet sits at an angle that leaves gaps, not because God has removed the armor, but because the believer has become disconnected from the atmosphere in which the armor was designed to function. A scuba diver does not stop being a scuba diver when the oxygen tank runs low, but the capacity to go deeper, to stay longer, to operate effectively in the environment they are in becomes critically limited without the thing that sustains them. Prayer is the oxygen of the armor of God, and the believer who tries to wear the armor without prayer is a soldier in full equipment who is slowly running out of air. Paul says, always keep on praying. Not pray when you feel like it. Not pray when the circumstances make it obvious that you need to. Not pray when the crisis is severe enough to justify the interruption to your schedule. Always. This word has broken more Christians than almost any other instruction in the New Testament, because it sounds impossible, because the gap between always and the actual frequency of most believers' prayer lives is wide enough to produce either guilt or denial or both. And both guilt and denial are traps. The guilt trap says, I am not praying enough, which means I am failing, which means the armor is not working, which means I am losing, which means I should probably stop trying because I clearly do not have what it takes. The denial trap says, nobody actually prays always. That's an unrealistic standard. Paul must have meant something more modest than what the word says. I'm doing fine. Both responses miss what Paul is actually describing. Always is not a standard of performance. It is a description of posture. A person who is always praying is not a person who is always on their knees with their eyes closed and their hands folded. They are a person whose life is oriented toward God, whose default direction is toward the throne rather than away from it, whose response to uncertainty is to turn toward the one who is certain, whose response to fear is to turn toward the one who is not afraid, whose response to the unexplained is to turn toward the one who has all the explanations. Always praying is not a schedule, it is a direction, and the direction, sustained and returned to and chosen again and again through every season and every circumstance, is what holds the armor in place. Paul never forgot about prayer. He could have ended the armor passage at verse 17. He could have closed the list with the sword of the Spirit and sent the Ephesians off to fight. He could not do it, because he had been in enough battles to know that the soldier without prayer is a soldier fighting on empty, that the armor without the atmosphere is equipment without power, that the most impressive spiritual equipment in the world cannot sustain a life that is not connected at its root to the God who gave it. So he kept writing. He described prayer with more words than he gave to any single piece of armor. He described it as something that happens on all occasions, in all kinds, for all the Lord's people, always, without stopping. He described it as the atmosphere, the thing that the armor breathes, the thing that makes the belt hold and the breastplate protect, and the boots grip and the shield deflect, and the helmet guard and the sword cut, the thing that turns a collection of spiritual equipment into a living, functioning, battle-ready soldier of the living God. And he called it the forgotten piece, not by name, but by placement, by the amount of attention he gave it, by the way he could not move on until he had said everything he needed to say about it. He placed it at the end, not because it was the least important, because in the grammar of spiritual warfare, the last word is the one that holds everything else together. And the last word Paul chose was prayer. You are wearing armor right now. You may not feel like you are. You may feel exposed and exhausted and too tired to do anything that sounds as demanding as always. Keep on praying. But the armor was given to you. It is on you. The righteousness of Christ is covering your heart. The truth is around your waist. The gospel of peace is beneath your feet. The faith you were given as a gift is in your hand. The salvation of God is on your head. It is all there. What the forgotten piece asks of you is not to generate more spiritual energy, or find more time, or pray longer, or better, or more impressively. It asks you to breathe, to turn toward God, right now, in this moment, in whatever condition you are in, with whatever words you have or no words at all, to be the person who, in the middle of everything, keeps the conversation going. Not because you are strong enough to sustain it, because the Spirit who lives inside you is strong enough to carry it. You just have to keep turning toward Him, on all occasions, with all kinds of prayers, always. The armor holds when the prayer breathes, and the prayer breathes whenever you choose to turn. Turn now.